A great episode for you today. We're going to have a super conversation about what is a body of work and why it's important. And I have a super guest for you.
Welcome to The Recognized Authority, a podcast that helps specialized consultants and domain experts on your journey to become known as an authority in your field. Here is your host, Alastair McDermott.
And before we get to today's episode, I just want to remind you about my email list. I'm now emailing week daily, so that is 5 times a week, and you can find that at therecognizedauthority.com/email. And I'm sending tips on how to build your authority. So today I have an amazing guest for you, somebody who was recommended to me by several different people. And in fact, I came across her work in the wild several years ago and I hadn't realized it. So let me bring on Pamela Slim. Pamela, thank you so much for being on the show.
I'm delighted to be here.
So, Pamela, you are an author, three-time author. I have one of your books right here, and this is the one we're going to be discussing a bit today. That's Body of Work. You also wrote Escape from Cubicle Nation, which I just realized I came across that book years ago, and I hadn't realized that you were the author, but I distinctly remember the title because it's so unique. And you've recently written The Widest Net as well. And they're all commercially published, I think, as well, which is cool and award winning. So I'm really happy to bring you on. And the thing that I was most interested in was when I heard the title of this book, Body of Work, I was super interested because body of work is a concept that I think about a lot when I'm talking to people about building authority and creating, not just creating one thing, but creating lots of things, which in a collective could be their body of work. So is that how you think about body of work? Can you tell me a little bit about why it how you think about it and why it's so important that you wrote an entire book called that?
Yes. The definition that I have in Body of Work about what body of work is everything that you create, contribute, affect, and impact throughout the course of your life. So it's very all-inclusive for one's life. And the root of it, one of the reasons why I wrote Body of Work after having written Escape from Cubicle Nation, where, of course, I am passionate about entrepreneurship, been doing it 28 years myself. I'd love to help people start businesses. But I found that many people found it really hard, had a challenge, thought they wanted to do it. The dream was actually better than the reality and wanted to maybe go back and do something else. And I realized through the lens of being a coach and a career coach that we had really limited ways that people thought about their life's work and their career journey. It tended to be an either or thing. Either you follow the path of being an employee, which in the entrepreneurial world, sometimes people would throw all kinds of negative connotations to that I think are unfair. And or on the other side, that you just become this very successful entrepreneur that scales and scales and gets acquired by Google and lives a dream sipping margaritas on the beach or something. And so from the context of individuals thinking about their body of work, I wanted a metaphor that people could use to give them flexibility to be experimenting and changing with all kinds of different things throughout the course of their life. So some people read the book that way, which I love, that helps give context to what they do. I was delighted and thrilled. This was back probably in 2013 when I was writing it, to have Brene Brown agree to read the book and blurb it. And it was just so amazing to me to hear from her perspective when I had actually put it out to her to request to do a blurb, as we all do for people who have written books. And I didn't hear. We were passing the deadline where we needed them for publication. And then I got this like screeching in all caps email from her that was like, oh my God, I hope we still have time. And what she was saying is that she, even as we all probably know her story by now, for people who have seen Brene's work, was like, I had this hard time reconciling being this researcher and social worker around shame and vulnerability, but also having this mainstream, author path. And she was describing how it helped to give her context to understand exactly how the different pieces of her work fit together and how she could use them at different times to communicate what she does. So there's that very deliberate path that I think about for individuals of contextualizing their experience. There's the other path, which I think you and I live every day, which is I also work with thought leaders to really help scale their impact through IP. And there's very deliberate decisions that you make about what you actually create. What are those things that you bring to life, often in the form of intellectual property, books, programs, processes that allow your work to actually have an impact because they're delivered in such a way that is really helpful to people to be changing behavior.
Okay, there's a lot of different threads I would like to pull on in this conversation. One of those, so the people listening to this are typically experts in their field,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes they have that expertise, but they don't have much visibility or recognition. And so one of the things that I think about is how do we get more visibility, and how are we seen or recognized as an authority or recognized as a thought leader? So when you're thinking about that problem, how do you think about body of work, and how do you approach that? Can you tell me a little bit about your thought process? What's important?
Yeah. So the subtitle for body of work is finding the thread that ties your story together. And one of the calls to action, the way that I talk every day to my clients about it, is that it can be super frustrating for people who truly do have expertise. A lot of us have seen in the world there's the fad of expertise, like, hey, 10 steps to being an expert in 30 days or less, which I always laugh at, like, not possible. Expertise is often developed over many decades and courses of study and experience and so forth. But there is the part of really recognizing that we have individual responsibilities as thought leaders. If we want our work to get out in the world, we need to take responsibility for how it is that we're describing it in such a way that it really connects with the market. And by the market, obviously there can be very different kinds of messages that we have and we tell about our body of work. So for example, if you're an entrepreneur and you're on stage doing a keynote in your area of interest, and your main audience there are individual people who you want to touch and impact by that message, and let's say you have one audience one day in the week that you're speaking that are a women's conference in Massachusetts, where you know that you might have a whole range of really, accomplished women who have a context in some cases of being parents in multiple roles and experiencing gender inequity and all that. So the way that you might tell your story with your thought leadership to that audience could be different if the next week you're speaking to the MMA Association of America, where you might then be drawing on parts of your body of work that be related to the context of that audience as they're thinking about it. So there's a message like that where you're really sharing it with individuals. There can be messages in the way you're framing your body of work when you're approaching partners. Maybe you want to be doing brand partnerships. Maybe you want to be doing a significant project with somebody. And so in that way, you're having to explain what your body of work is and help them understand why it is that they should trust you to not only have great information, but also be a solid, reputable partner. Maybe a very different kind of story. I work with a lot of people that are getting close to exit and exiting their businesses. Different kind of story that you might tell to a potential acquirer of the business, where you're really having to explain in many ways more the business context in which your IP lives. So there is, on one hand, I think just the theme of all of us that have been cranky, present company included, when we sit back and we're like, dag nabbit, or a stronger word, we see somebody who we know maybe be much less experienced than we are and less of an expert, who's gracing all of the stages talking about the thing that we're experts in. And we're human to just say, that's not fair. Don't they know that I'm the one who has the answers? I argue it is our responsibility, if it's important to you, to have a wider impact with your work, to be figuring out how it is that you can get yourself on those stages. And you're the one that really has to learn the skills or implement the kind of business practices in order to be seen and visible. It actually was really the doorway into the widest net, because once people really understand what they have and what they want to create, the next question is, how do I get it out at scale? And that's really all about what the widest net is about. So there's always kind of a thread from one book to the next. But I think one of the starting places is to recognize that I have never found that the market automatically just recognizes that's an amazing person and they are the world's expert. We have to help shape that message and get it the places where it needs to get.
Yeah, I think it goes back to Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come, and that does not apply when it comes to things like content marketing, creating authority content. You have to do more. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how do you approach that?
So I think in the context of ecosystems is the way that is really my framework and my point of view around marketing, where you have an area of expertise, I generally think of for any of the clients who you're working with. So regardless of who your client is, if it tends to be a corporate client, if it is an individual client, you think about it first contextually of what is my client really trying to do? What is their overwhelming problems that they're trying to solve? What are their aspirations? And usually by definition, they need to get a whole variety of different input from experts in particular areas to help them solve the problem. They need to get inspiration, hear from other people who have done it. Often they use products and services that help them to meet their needs. So just thinking of the shared audience that you and I have, right? Thought leaders with expertise who are trying to get more visible, known, and make more money and get their work to have more impact. Hopefully they're not just talking to just you or just me. They need IP attorneys and web designers and PR agents and book agents and publishing companies. They use software to run their business. So the first part for me is already saying, based on who it is that you want to reach, where are these watering holes, these places in person and online where they already have groups of people who are ideal for you to be connecting with. And for me, it's more doing that strategic analysis to say, let's say in any given year, where are the stages where I really should be? Where are the best podcasts where already this wonderful person has gathered an audience for me? So I just walk in the door to my office like today, show up, sit down, have a conversation where you, in this case, Alastair, have done the job of cultivating the audience. That's a way I think strategically you can begin to have more of a leveraged approach. And then, of course, there's a lot more detail underneath it that I'm sure you consult with around as well, of ways that you really do have to have a much more clear focus and vision, have a special area, have specific content that drives SEO, that helps people to find you. It was funny. I just had a conversation yesterday with somebody who's so cool, who has a number of like specialized dance um, uh, experiences, like practices that she's really built and codified as a business. And I was like, how in the world did you find me? And she was like, thanks to Google, because I Googled where can I find an expert in licensing and certification? And because I've done so much content around that, I popped up high in the results. And so that's the kind of alignment we want to get, is good SEO that's focused on a specific expertise and niche. And then it's also really supported by showing up in the places where your ideal clients are already hanging out. The feeling that to me I'm always going for is where ideal clients are like, oh my God, you're everywhere. Like, you're just everywhere. And I'm thinking, no, I'm not. I'm just very deliberately in the places where I know you, ideal client, are looking for resources, support, and information.
Yeah, you're in the right place. So okay, so showing up. One thing you mentioned there, you said so much content, and I just want to dig into that a little bit, because I think that there's, when it comes to creating expertise, uh, content that demonstrates expertise based content. Um, there is, so first of all, to create content is hard. So like what we're doing now, getting up on camera, doing a live, this will be turned into a podcast. It isn't something that you can do out the gate without any experience of it. Like you do have to get some reps in, I think. And the learning curve isn't incredibly steep, but you do have a bit of a learning curve to that. It's also time consuming to create content, and the type of conversation that we're having now is on the basis of, years, decades of experience in the particular field. So when I think about creating content and how much content we need to create and quality, there's kind of like a slider. I think that people think there's a slider with quality on one end and quantity on the other. I'm just wondering how you think about that. Like, how much content do we need to create? And then where does that quality slider need to be set?
I do agree with you. I think there's a slider. It's driven by a number of factors. And so I do agree. My history has been really coming up through the blogging world. So I started in 2005, the Escape from Cubicle Nation blog, which was brand new to me. I might differ a slight bit in what you said. If you really have to know what you're doing, I had no idea. I did take a class. I did a class with Suzanne Falter, a class called Get Known Now, which I appreciate so much to this day. I think that was in 2004. That gave me an overview of really understanding more the dynamics of content marketing and blogging at that point. That was really a big thing. So it helped me to get some footing underneath me. But I will say, sometimes I wonder, like starting way back when I designed my own blog, and I am not a graphic designer, I just began to write and share ideas in the best way that I could. Now, when I see so many classes and information about how to do things perfectly, how to have the perfect podcast and blog, in some cases, I see it actually gets in people's way because they feel like they have to master all of these now much more documented skills, where I think there is a natural process. As you're saying, there have to be some fundamentals. When you're writing for an audience, you have to make sure that you have good, grammatically correct writing, all those kind of things to make sure it's publishable. Same thing to have a decent quality audio. But the main thing, I think, once you get that baseline, is that it's the process of identifying really what is that natural habit, that rhythm you can get into. I call them tiny marketing actions, where you can sustain a certain level of production of content that is related to decisions that you make in your business. So for people who are doing it individually, I've always done all my own content. I write my own books 100%. I do all my own podcasts. I write every blog post, every LinkedIn post. All of that is all me. The only way recently that I've begun to engage a team is with my own podcast, The Widest Net. I have a team that does production, and they do a great job at taking the initial episode, creating a blog post from it for the transcript, doing some social assets and things like that. So there's one piece of figuring out, if you are just an individual, what is a sustainable pace so you don't just burn yourself out. Another business decision that you can make is to get some support sometimes from people who can be helping to get key information out. And we know from our marketing friends who study this for a living, we can certainly look at data that says you must publish your, at least one newsletter a week. You have to have X number of blog posts or X number of podcast episodes. For some folks who are really more in the, internet marketing, really dialing in their marketing operations so that everything is perfectly measurable, which I admire. If that's the way that you're really running your business, I can see where you would be looking at some of those pieces. But I have, in my experience of working with people, found that if you are not really grounding it in what is a realistic production of content on your end that you can be excited about, that can be sustainable, sooner or later, you're just going to burn yourself out. And for me, there's a reason why I've written my newsletter for 18 years. I don't write it every day like you. I write it once a month. But for me, it's really a sustainable way. I've had people who have been on my list all that time. And so I think contextually, and we could dig into maybe a couple of different examples of types of experts and types of markets. It really makes a difference depending upon who is your market and what is your business model, because there can be experts who can have, for example, 5 key clients during the year that maybe are larger corporate clients that meet all their financial goals in order to be selling to them. And a content strategy for that audience could be extremely different, where maybe there's a very specific research project you could do once a year that's dialed in with those clients, where then you might do a webinar and you might have maybe some updates coming out. You would in no way need the volume of content than when you're building more of a B2C audience, where it's all about fighting all the algorithms and needing just to provide tons and tons of daily content in order to meet the numbers. So it's that famous consulting answer of it depends. But I would say that you do need to be choosing what is the vehicle, the marketing vehicle, the content creation vehicle that really is best aligned with the way that you communicate, making sure it matches with also the way that your ideal clients are receiving the information. And then, just like you've done before we hit record, you were sharing with me some of the things that I love, where you have optimized the process in which you're creating content so that when you're doing it, like right now, we have live stream, you're going to break that up as a podcast, you're making it as the process is optimized as possible so that you get the most leverage out of content. And I think that's really a strategy that a lot of people can use. It's a little different than the old days where we wrote these like long blog posts all the time. And there really was that. I don't even know we made money back in those days, but you can leverage content a different way where you may not need to create as much, but you can create small ways to continue to nudge back and extend that content.
Yeah, I find this whole topic really interesting, and the way that I think about quality when it comes to content creation, I kind of it's a bit like the dial is kind of swinging in the wind a little bit, because I think that, like you talked a little bit, and I don't think you used this words, but this is the way I think about it, like a chilling effect on people creating content because the bar is higher now. The way that I think about it is, in order to get good at creating content, you probably have to create bad content and then mediocre content and then good content and then great content. And I think that you have to go through that learning curve. So I do encourage people to make the best content that they can make, but I really hate the idea that we're saying you should only create great content, because if you start with that in mind, there is a chilling effect that stops people even trying, so that's something that I think about a bit, that there is a learning curve. And I think that, like, one thing you talked about was how you were blogging for years, and you wrote your first book, published your first book in 2009, and I'm sure you were blogging for years before that. And so the writing process that you went through, I'm sure that you went through a big learning curve with that writing as well, not just learning about writing, but even about your topic, because writing helps us to learn. So I think all of that comes into the mix for me when it comes down to talking about quality versus quantity. So that's yeah. So
Yeah,
okay.
it is a good, can I just did one quick thing to say about that? Because I think it's a really important context as you're talking about the way that experts are thinking about their body of work, how they're building it, and what it is that they're sharing. So in the case where you are a recognized expert in a particular functional area, and then often in our bodies of work that you might take on a new line of exploration. For many authors that I work with, it could be a new book in a particular area. And so there's the process of actually exploring, codifying the idea, testing it out in the world, to the place where you get it in a much more structured way, where we could think, for example, of putting it in the shape of a book that's a tested model or a method. Um, it, and that process often, the way that content can help us get there for a lot of people, is where you do explore the topic on podcast, or you might be writing like I did with Escape from Cubicle Nation. I always say, when I started, I had been a management consultant for 10 years in Silicon Valley. So I certainly met many disgruntled employees who really wanted to leave and start a business. I had done it myself successfully, but it pretty much was the case study of one. So when I started, one of the main mantras I would say with clients when I was helping them, if they had a question I didn't know, is, it's a great question, I don't know, but I'll find out. And in the pursuit of finding out is where I created so many different connections and connected with experts, where I was sharing along the way what it was that I was learning over a series of years. I did develop a perspective, a point of view, a body of work of working with hundreds and that really thousands of people through the years to make sure that the advice that I was giving is something that was solid. But some people cannot look at it that way, where you think if I'm an expert, the content that I share has to be this finalized codified IP that's based on the maturity of this particular part of my body of work. And that's, I think, where people can get stuck, is what is engaging to me. And when we talk about content, like, readers don't care about content the way that we care about as a business. People want to have interesting, thought-provoking, helpful pieces of information, ideas from you on a consistent basis. That can be everything from engaging ways that you talk to people on LinkedIn, to interesting curated podcast episodes where you're bringing in interesting experts to people. So that's the part I think that can be helpful, is depending upon where you are in your thought leader journey. For some people, they're like, they have the great book that nobody's really listening to, so they can take that codified book and create content that might be a little bit more focused and specific, like, white papers or powerful webinars or really amazing keynotes to get the message out. But there's a whole other use case for how you actually develop your thought leadership and different depths of your expertise by using content. And to me, that makes it so much easier, because then you can just be curious and open and exploring the key ideas. And then you hear back from your audience, what are the different areas that they like the most?
Yeah, I think that's why I'm running this as an experiment. I started in November, where I started doing the week daily email. And so for me, it's as a way to explore different ideas and concepts. And also there's an accelerating effect of, first of all, accelerating thinking and learning. But there is
Mm.
also an accelerating effect in terms of, I noticed that it's polarizing my email list. So I got a lot of unsubscribes very quickly in the first couple of weeks that I did that. But then I started getting more replies to my emails on a more regular, consistent basis. And so I could see that there's an accelerating effect here, both in my thinking and also in people reaching out to talk to me. So, and one of the great things about email is the way that it's you can go from broadcast to the one-on-one conversation. Jonathan Stark talks about that a lot. I think that it's a great way to start conversations with people one-to-one. So, but for me, it's very much this is me learning on the fly as well. And maybe it's not learning the concept, but it's learning how I'm describing the concept or a different metaphor that I'm using for something. So that that's and this is almost like, I think, journaling. In a way, I think that a great way to start out creating content when you're not an expert is to just journal what you learn, and that's a great way to start out. So yeah, those just some thoughts. What else is important in the mix here when we're talking about creating a body of work? What else is important? Is there anything that we haven't kind of dug into yet?
Yeah, I think by default, we're always creating a body of work. We're, we're affecting, impacting things. We're creating stuff by definition, by the way we are in the world, by, whatever kind of work we do. Like, that is our body of work. The conscious dimension of it is, what actually do you want to create? What is that story that you want to be having that is much more pointed? What are ways that you can be more strongly bringing in your point of view and having that clear way that people can begin to understand who you are? And so I think that's just important to recognize, is that by default, if we just sort of go with the flow, we create whatever. For example, we don't necessarily have a plan, or we don't have ways that we're taking control of the narrative at different chapters of our body of work to help our audience understand and integrate the changes. That's where people can just make their own determination about what your body of work is. So they're like, Alastair's a cool cat, but I don't know, I don't really know what he does. Like, I saw him do, and I'm just using you as a hypothetical example, that, people might say, well, he did that thing, a few years ago, and then I saw him shifting over and doing something else, and I'm not really clear what's going on. In your head, you may know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're shifting, but we have to make that process visible to our audience as we create it. And I find by our nature, and often all the people that I work with who are really creative and smart and driven and impact mission driven, that the need to be creating useful things is really important. And there are a few of them just that really stay within a particular line of expertise within a functional area and just deepen it over time. For many others, it does take different chapters. And so not only do you need to be thinking deliberately about what is that work that you're creating, but how are you building in the practice of making that process visible to your audience? That can include things like just giving them updates and things like your newsletter, but also in updating and continually reshaping the narrative on your website. That, maybe every couple of years, sometimes we just sort of have it out there and we don't really look at it. Like, does my bio really make sense anymore? Am I bringing these threads together in a way that people can understand? And it takes a long time for people to understand the shift. And it takes quite a bit of work for us to be really narrating that arc. And so that's a piece I find that people don't often think about. Like, how are you being deliberate about what are you excited to create? What would be really useful for the market? And I find it just to be vapid, just sort of hollow. if you're just creating stuff to follow this formula for like, how can I be seen as an expert? Oh, okay, I need to write a white paper, as opposed to really connecting it to what actually is going to be useful to this audience that I care about impacting and supporting. And so you want to be deliberate about what that is, what's the shape and form of it that's the most helpful, and then making sure that you are the one responsible for the narrative. You can't often say it enough times. And I find I will do things as a regular practice, for example, when I'm on podcasts, of knowing, in this case, and I'd love to talk about Body of Work. It's actually the 10-year anniversary, because it came out January of 2014, not like the day today, but of the month of it coming out. And I find that it's so refreshing to be able to bring that back as part of my body of work. The way that I can contextualize and refresh it to what I'm doing now is in my specialized work now of having an agency to build licensing and certification programs with thought leaders. It's bringing together body of work. What are you creating consciously with the widest net? What's a method of bringing it out to the world at scale? And so this is a way I can always be contextualizing in conversation with people so that they can see the way that the different threads fit together. And that, I think, requires sometimes conscious scratching on the back of napkins to say, what's the best way that I can make that an easy to understand, situation? And then it requires the discipline of deciding on any given year, what is that specific cadence that I have? What is that content I'm creating, through which vehicles like newsletter, podcast, social, and what would give me the highest leverage in terms of the kinds of content that I can create and reliably deliver. That's it. That's the key. Like, you just can't be in a rush and then just do nothing. And then it just requires so much effort and energy to pop up and be visible again.
Yeah, and so reliably deliver. I guess I think you're probably talking about consistency, right? Actually being consistent.
Yes, it is consistent. It doesn't necessarily mean that, like, now you're stuck on the schedule where you promise that you're publishing your newsletter on the first of the month every month. Like, if you publish on the third, I think nothing terrible is going to happen. It's that, you generally, there is consistency, but it's also that you are more than just sharing content. You're actively involved in conversation, right? You're connected to the world. You're showing up in deliberate ways. And again, for each business, it's going to be a little bit different. Sometimes people need to take sabbaticals. Sometimes people will unplug and just do things to attend to their own personal lives, which again, to me, is a really deliberate choice. But you want to be engaged in the communities in which you're showing up. And yes, that's consistency, but it's also in that you're really actively showing up as a human and participating in conversations that are happening around your area of expertise.
Can we get a little bit more specific then about the types of content that you talk to? I mean, I use the word content. Is that a term actually that you use when you're talking about body of work? It's content? I know it's nice. It's very generic, and because it's so generic, it means that it's very broad, but it also has this kind of negative connotation, has this kind of blandness to it. How do you think about it?
Yeah, I do. I do think about it in terms of content. And so I think in a couple of different ways. From a marketing perspective, I think it's a perfectly fine way to describe it for within the marketing function of your business, of just, yes, what is that specific content, the ideas, the writing podcast episodes, etc., that's going to be the most useful and engaging for your audience. When it comes to body of work IP, that to me can be more, where usually from an area of expertise, you have a point of view about how it is that you have a method and a model, and often that is a little bit more complex. So sometimes that goes into the monetization side of businesses, where you might have programs, methods that you license to other people, or certify people in, or classes that you teach around a particular area. But that's where it can be much more than just a piece of content, like a newsletter article, a podcast episode, a blog post. And it really ends up being much more of a thorough piece of content. So it could be an entire method that's well documented and tested. I am a fan for people, especially within more specific subject matter expertise areas and medicine or health or science, where you can do a very well done white paper something that's just not academic, I mean, I'm going to piss off academics that not all academic papers are boring, but not just something that really comes from the academic context, but something that's really useful, a deep dive into a topic that becomes really useful for people to understand a topic. For example, the other piece of content that I think is so useful is research. One of my dear colleagues, Susan Beyer, who I write about in chapter 3 in The Widest Net, is a attitudinal segmentation researcher, and she does research for thought leaders, usually on an annual basis, of doing specific surveys, really digging into topics that are of the most interest for her clients. Her clients are mainly marketing agencies, and so each year they have a whole interesting, fresh research project that they can talk about, they can really weave as the foundation for a lot of their content. And I find people, I don't know about you, but I find people eat up research. We have a real, joy about that. And that could be highly, highly leveraged content as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things that I did when I was niching down and changing over from my old brand, which was Website Doctor, over to the Recognized Authority. At the time, I knew that I wanted to niche down, but I didn't really know exactly where the niche was. So I surveyed over 1,000 consultants and turned that into a mini small scale research project. And I did that at the urging of my business coach at the time, Philip Morgan. And Philip is big into small scale research and talks to me a lot about that actually. We I think we have an episode where we talk about that on the podcast as well. But doing that survey, and then first of all I did the survey of 1,000 consultants through multiple choice, with some paragraph-based text answers as well, but mostly through multiple choice to make it easy for them to get some quantifiable information. I did that, and then I followed up with I think about 45 telephone interviews, or well, there were Zoom interviews, but that gave me a mountain of data and a mountain of content really. That I think there's about 3 books worth of content in that research data. And yeah, so I think that it was so useful to do, and it really it connected me with a lot of people. I got so much information from it. I understood the market so much better. I understood lots of very nuanced things about the market that I wanted to address. Like for example, one thing that was important for me was, why are websites not important to this market? Like, why are they not investing in websites? Why is it less important than other things? And then I got into the dependency of the market on referrals and networking and word of mouth versus other types of marketing, which are more website dependent. And so that kind of uncovered a whole, gave me incredible insights. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of research, and and in fact, I'm going to have Susan on the show. I was speaking with her last week. I think you introduced me,
Yay!
so thank you.
I'm so glad. She is
Yeah.
a hoot. I think you will love her. Yeah.
Oh
And I
yeah,
have just been
I had a quick
thoroughly
chat with her.
thrilled.
I think just before Christmas, and or maybe it was just after Christmas. But she's fantastic, and yeah, I think that's going to be a super conversation as well. Yeah. So okay, let's
Oh, can I, and here I
go
am
ahead.
now. You made me think of one thing. So here's another example that's almost taking research to another level. My friend Jonathan Fields, I don't know if you know Jonathan, who runs a Good Life Project podcast and also Sparketype. So Sparketype, he's created a tool that's really an assessment for people to really understand some of their natural work style. So part of the business model that Jonathan built in that particular vein is he had the free Sparketype assessment, which is a assessment anybody can take, and they take the questions, and then they're delivered a base level kind of report that tells them like what are their primary Sparketypes. They of course can then choose to get more detailed information and application through a little bit of a lighter dollar, but investment. But he built that whole model that was the starting place where he gathered, I think it was at the point of publication or doing his book proposal, was around 400,000 responses that he had for people in Sparketype. Then he got the book deal for Sparked, which is Sparked is the book about Sparketype. Now he has a podcast in partnership with LinkedIn all about Sparketypes. Similar thing with Sally Hogshead, who wrote How to Fascinate, where she has her Fascinate profile. Gretchen Rubin of the 4 Tendencies and the Happiness Project. You can see a lot of experts that are building not only one-time annual research in a topic, but are creating something like an assessment that give a short-term benefit for people, but also, as you can see, can build sometimes hundreds of thousands of people on their list, that make things like getting a book, make things like, sharing about what they're doing so much easier when they're building an audience that way. So that's always something that I encourage clients to do where it's relevant and possible, is to say, could there be this way that you have this ongoing link to your work where anybody new visiting your website can be jumping in? And of course, you get their email, which is handy for you, but they're also getting something valuable as a result. And it straddles the line between, quote, content and a product.
Yeah, I like that. And in fact, I did have something like that on my website previously. My biggest issue is I just have too many different pieces of content. I don't want to overwhelm people when they come to my website, because I have so many different tools and free guides and all sorts of things. And so what I'm trying to do now, and in fact, if anybody's listening to this and is interested, if you've got a problem in building authority and that's related to that, if you send me an email, I'm sure I've got something that can be of some help. I'd be happy to share it, but I don't want to overwhelm people who come to my website, because I could give them so much stuff. So that's one issue. I think maybe the listener has a different issue, which is they don't know where to start with creating their body of work. What advice would you have for somebody who's not sure where to start?
So I would think first about getting really clear about who your audience is. And some people might know already because they're like functional experts, where they're already working in a field where, their clients know them really well. They're just more people that need to know about what it is that they're doing. So using a lot of Susan's method in the way that she describes audience segments is more defining them by problem, challenge, or aspiration. What are the specific problems or challenges that your audience is trying to solve? So in that way, when you think of maybe, there's somebody who has great expertise and they just want to get more visible. And so that could be a scientist, it could be a medical doctor, it could be a psychologist. Many people in different functional areas could fit in that definition. But at first, you're really just trying to get clear and connected with who is it that you really want to be reaching with this information. And then also doing that analysis, which I do, like you, always a lot in engagement with people. In the day-to-day work that you're doing, you probably already know, and you can pay attention to where are those areas where people get stuck? What are those general questions that everybody has a challenging time with? And that's where you can begin to create more of the architecture of what would be the kinds of information and content that you could create. And I think about it in having a couple initial starting places that are important just to activate in the internet marketing world. We call the product funnel, just ways in which you can be connecting with people and communicating over time, where there's something that you could share that is more, lead magnet is often the vernacular people use, something for an email trade that is just really useful. And for a lot of people, it is just an immediate application. How do you get 1,000 people on your mailing list? Or, the quick start guide to becoming an authority, something that could even be like a short 2-page PDF, but something that immediately people are like, yes, I want that. How to not lose your shirt in running Facebook ads, those kind of things that where people are just like, yes, I don't just want general content and information. I want something specific. So if you can think about something for an email trade as often a foundational piece of content to be bringing people into your list. The second thing that I think of is what some folks call keystone or cornerstone content. I tend to think of maybe 4 posts a year for longer form, usually blog posts. I think it's helpful for SEO to have things that are published on your website, but those could be deeper dives into areas that are related to explaining your body of work for what it is that you're creating. So you might want to have a much deeper dive. As I mentioned earlier on, a couple of years ago wrote that, like, what is licensing and certification? Because I knew I wanted to really go through and explain things, because there were just super common questions that people had. And over time, that's been a really cornerstone piece of content that people need. So during the year, could be could be once a quarter, that you're really taking time more to be investing in a deeper piece of content. So that's another piece I think to be getting clear about. And then the third piece is what is your choice. And the widest net, I call it, of your beacon. So a primary communication vehicle that you're using to be sharing your thought leadership and expertise. Where you're beginning, that is where I really encourage people to be focusing on one. So whether it's really dialing into your newsletter, you look at somebody like James Clear from Atomic Habits, has now, over 1 million subscribers. Clearly, he has gone all in extremely deliberately to really put the focus on creating that newsletter as his primary beacon, the place that you're driving people. For other people, a podcast is really the primary beacon that they can use, where they can have that consistent publication. For those like you and I who've been around for a long time, I do have a long-term newsletter for 18 years. I actually had an Escape from Cubicle Nation podcast for about maybe 7 years or so. And now with the widest net, that is something that is my, forward next 5 to 10 years, where I publish on a bi-monthly basis, so 2 episodes a month. And that's the way that I have the commitment that I know that I'm moving forward. I actually also created Smart IP, which is a weekly LinkedIn newsletter. And that's been an experiment that for me, I've waited a long time to make sure that I can sustain that level of activity. But I think we're very similar in that, where I know I have that commitment to essentially, in the form of LinkedIn newsletters, create something that is a little bit maybe of a longer, more detailed way that I would just generally do a post and an update, can feel sustainable. So you can see people generally who are more established, who are well in that pattern of this like dependable, reliable, consistent content publication, that open up more channels. To start, I recommend that you zero in on one primary beacon and make that choice. And then that's the way with your email trade, often internal to your newsletter and your email, where you might have a little bit of a nurture sequence. You can orient people to you, help them with some giveaways that can be helpful. But to keep it simple is just where you can then look at a given month and say, okay, what am I actually producing? Maybe, one blog post a month, and I'll do a weekly newsletter, or I'll do a weekly newsletter. And then that's the part that you just want to get out consistently, at least 6 months, to really get rolling and notice how it happens before you might consider adding another channel. It depends on resource. If you're well resourced, which is great, you can be bringing in other experts to help activate some of these other channels. But I've just found, for people who are newer to the process, like you said, there's so many things to learn, even technically, about doing a good job in any one of those marketing vehicles, that you don't want to overload yourself with too many at the same time.
Yeah, I strongly encourage everybody, start simple and then layer complexity on top of that. And that's how I started this. And like, we're recording, I think, episode 156 of this podcast. So this ain't my first rodeo when it comes to any of the editing or the setup or anything. But if you go back and listen to my first episodes, the sound quality isn't as good. I'm more nervous. The questions don't flow as well. Um, all of that. And that's just normal. That's part of the learning curve. But I certainly didn't record live. And even my very first episodes, I didn't do on video. I just did audio only. As I got a bit more comfortable, I started recording video, but I didn't publish the video because of the editing issues. And then when I got to episode 100, I decided to go live. And that was to stop me procrastinating about doing video, because once it's live, it's live. So that was kind of a hack to force a forcing function to stop myself procrastinating. So I think that you can, I would say, like you said, start out more simple, and you can add that complexity later as you learn. This has been super interesting. Thank you so much. We're going to start a wrap up. I do have a few questions, that I mentioned in the pre-show that I typically ask. And one of those is, what is the number one tip that you would give to somebody who wants to build their authority?
The number one tip I would say is take some time away to really do some deeper reflection about the idea, the topic from within your own body of work to date, that really gives you some juice and excitement. The things that maybe people are really curious about, the areas where you really have strength and you have a unique point of view. Because as we've been talking about throughout this whole show, there will be the experience of testing, trying, kind of thinking about different ideas and seeing what it is that sticks. But a core principle to always think about where we are driving is to have some area of specialty. It can feel like, oh, I don't want to leave anybody out. I have all these things that I could talk about. Part of the practice we want to start to look at is ways to be exploring a particular vein in a deep way, so that it will allow you to actually build your body of work, your thought leadership, this body of knowledge and like real assets. In Escape from Cubicle Nation, actually, when I started the chapter in my that chapter of my business after being a management consultant, initially I said, I will work with people in general with their career issues. I will work with people who want to leave corporate to start a business. And I also will do consulting for larger organizations because I had done that before. As I went through time, I was like, that's a whole bunch of stuff to be talking about. So I zeroed in on that particular stage of transition of people leaving corporate to start a business. And it allowed me to really go deep in that area, and then certainly shine in from a branding perspective, have kind of a zippy way that people connected with that material. Doing that in publishing is what led my publisher, Penguin Random House portfolio, to reach out to me because they had seen my body of work, in that area. So probably it's paradoxical advice in that have fun, explore, and don't be afraid to really zero in at first on a specific area where you have some expertise, and let that roll.
Yeah, and the way that I think about that is, you can't become a recognized authority in your field if you don't choose a field. So you actually do have to choose something to, but you can also, when you're starting out, it doesn't have to be the be all and end all. Think of it as a beachhead or a test campaign, and test it out. And if you don't like the shoes, you can bring them back and get a new pair. You can try something else, if it doesn't feel right. But yeah, I
Yes.
think that's important. Can you tell us about a business mistake or failure that you experienced and what you learned from it?
There have been many, many, many over the years. I think one of the things that I actually wrote about it in Escape from Cubicle Nation at the time that I was writing that book. My husband had a construction business here in the Phoenix, Arizona area, which was like 2006, 2007. And people might have remembered what happened in the real estate market construction. So I had been, I think, so zeroed in and focused just on my own body of work. We had been making certain financial decisions in support of his business. He, was really successful, had great clients and everything. The market, it felt like from one day to the next, completely collapsed. So it was really in a tailspin, and we had just made serious investments in heavy equipment, which any of you know that business are extremely large ticket items. So one of the lessons I learned there is I was sort of in my own world of just, that's my business. And my husband's off doing his thing and not really paying closer attention, I think, to what was happening in the financial trends before we were making investments. You can't always know. Like, I feel like we'll judge ourselves as brilliant business people if it happens to turn out right because of market conditions. And if it turns out wrong, we can blame ourselves, all for it. But since that time, I've been much more deliberate about how it is that I take risk and make financial considerations overall for the family, but also overall in my business, so that I'm not getting myself to a place where I have this huge responsibility for a gigantic team, and I'm just at the whim of huge market shifts, which will always continue to happen.
Yeah, that's a good one. And I started my business in early 2007, so I know all about that one as well. I thought it
Yeah.
was a great time to start. Okay, is there a business book or resource that's been important for you, or that you would recommend?
I always recommend Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott for people it is a book about writing, but I do feel like it's also a book of the essence of the creative process. Anne Lamott is hysterical. She tells the greatest stories. I actually just recommended it to my 16-year-old daughter, and she has loved it because we were going through homework with her and we were talking about sometimes blocks she can have to writing. And that book is so helpful. When I wrote Escape, I literally carried it with me everywhere I went. At that point, I worked from home. And so I was like, anywhere I'd go in the house, when I'd have the like 5 times a day moments of panic that I could never finish the book and it would be terrible, I would just open to a random page and she would have some very comforting story about, yes, writing is awful and it feels terrible, but what you're going through is completely natural. So I highly recommend that for people. Another book that happens to be about writing was recommended to me by Guy Kawasaki is If You Want to Write by Brenda Euland. It's a book that was written in 1938. The subtitle is A Book About Art, Independence, and Spirit. And it's just one of the most wonderful love letters to creation and helpful tools for really getting underneath, activating your practice of creating.
I'm going to ask you a meta question. Um, are you writing a new book now that you've just published your third book? Do you have your next book in the works?
I am playing around with what the premise is. I tend to work in 5 to 7 year cycles with new books. And so I do know what it is. I think of the nature, I was talking about it with my friend this week. I think I know the nature of what it's going to be, but I am not actively writing it right now because this year is all about deliberate focus in building the licensing side of the house.
Hmm.
And I love to write. So I could actually get distracted with a product that I'm really not ready to do. But I'm already starting to document notes and so forth.
And then, just as a follow on to that, how important has writing and publishing books been for your business?
Massively important. Massively important. It is, I think, one of the best ways for people who have an important story to share and who will go through the process of writing. There is nothing I have found that is better for just getting your work out in the world to people in a way that would be, I think, impossible with other means. It just takes so much more work. One of my friends, Andy Kwok, who lives in Paris, originally from Taiwan, found Escape from Cubicle Nation in a garbage can in Paris. That's the way that he initially found me and my work, which is one of my favorite stories. Um, but like, that is a way. I just talked with a prospective client the other day, and he had been recommended to my services to him by 2 of my current clients that he had talked to independently that recommended me. And then he said, as I was getting ready for our connection call, I realized he'd been in the military a really long time. And he said, I forgot, like maybe you did, that you had written Body of Work. He goes, I realized you were the author of Body of Work. And I read that book right when I was leaving the military, when my head was spinning and I was trying to make sense of my life. And he said that made such a big difference. So it's like, who knew? There'd be no idea that he would have been running across that information in the form of a book. I encourage those who are writing a book to try to make it. I know Ryan Holiday talks a lot about like the perennial bestseller. Try to avoid just like AI this year, where that probably that content's going to be relevant. That's a good blog post, but try to write a book that can have some legacy and endurance, because it can continue to do the work for you of first being relentlessly helpful to people and just helping them solve problems, but also it can be something that can just continue to market for you as the years go on.
Hmm. Super. Thank you for answering that. I know we're running a bit over the top of the hour, so apologies. The last question I have is just I like to get a bit of flavor. Do you read fiction books? Is there anything that you love and recommend?
When I was little, I was all about fiction books. I loved all the Narnia Chronicles and anything that was like adventure and all of that. I have completely really fallen off, besides the occasional beach read, like rom-com trashy novel, which I love just for escapism. Uh, Before we recorded, you were saying it could also be maybe like a show. I think it's more my call back to your homeland, my Irish and Scottish and English roots of my family. I can't get enough of any like Sense and Sensibility, Outlander, any kind of show that's taking place in my ancestral homeland. I will just dig in really deep. I've actually done a couple trips now to Scotland, which is where my family heritage is. And that is the thing right now that's really calling me from a nonfiction book business world.
Yeah, I think the escapism stuff is important. Like for me, the escapism stuff is usually science fiction and fantasy, but it's just as trashy as the rom-com stuff, I'm sure.
Exactly.
Um, okay, well, Pamela, where can people find out more if they're interested in learning more about the certification and all of the other great stuff that you have?
Yeah, so you can find me at pamelaslim.com, that I'm sure we'll link in the show notes. Also, LinkedIn is the primary social media channel where I'm very active, and so you can reach out. Just let me know that you heard about me on this show. And as I said, I just started my weekly newsletter called Smart IP, where you can subscribe there once we connect, where I'll be just sharing a lot more of the detailed information about creating more of the scalable IP.
Yeah, and I think that it's a really important topic as well. Um, Licensing and scaling and certification are they're probably on the map for me in probably another 12 to 18 months, I would say. Maybe a little bit earlier if I get my act together this year.
That's right.
So
Well, you know who to hit up once
I
you get to that point. I appreciate it.
I certainly do. Pamela, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.